Onboarding is a trial period for both parties. It is a chance to get to know both parties better and see if the relationship's going to work out long term. A company's onboarding is a good tell of the overall employee development practices. Welcome to How to Survive Your Boss, the podcast that spills the tea on toxic workplaces, nightmare bosses, and the unspoken rules of corporate survival. I'm your host, Kiana, and in season 1, we're breaking down the key milestones in your relationship with your boss. Because let's be real, you don't know what you don't know. From interviews to promotions to that moment you realize your boss might actually be the worst, we're here to help you see the game before you get played. This season, I'm joined by my little sis, Tara, who's just starting her career and getting her first taste of the working world. And today we're going to talk about onboarding, the awkward, confusing, and sometimes deceptive process of getting settled into a new job. What should you be paying attention to? How do you spot early signs of red flags? And is it really normal to sit through 8 hours straight of training videos with no idea of what you're actually supposed to be doing? Well, let's break it down. You ready, little T?
I sure am.
So I guess we could start with just the basics of what onboarding is, because it's different for different companies. But typically your onboarding process is the first 90 days at a new business. So in some countries, they actually have probation periods. A fun fact. So in Poland, for example, when I would hire employees in Poland, the first 90 days were like a probation period where we would agree on the offer, we would agree on all the terms for employment, but then in the first 90 days, either party could essentially determine this isn't a fit. This is not working out. That is not the culture in the US. In the US, it's typically your first 90 days. Sometimes it might be shorter. I think with your like part-time seasonal job, obviously there wasn't even like the seasonal job itself was less than 90 days.
Yeah.
So obviously not the same case there. But when you get into corporate, and more importantly, a full-time role, you're going to look at 90 days. Now, if you're doing an internship, you probably have a much slower onboarding period just because the entire experience of the internship is kind of like company onboarding. And it just depends on like what role. So typically you have your first 90 days. That's actually a common vocabulary in business. If you're in a more senior role, what you do is you set a 30, 60, 90, which is basically a plan that you agree on with your manager. So within the first 30 days, here's everything you need to accomplish. Within the first 60 days, here's everything you need to accomplish, and then so forth with 90. And then basically you have a check-in with your manager at each 30-day mark. Did you achieve those goals? Are you behind? And if you have a good manager, hopefully they're trying to help you achieve everything you set out for. But that's kind of like, I think, the biggest, let's say, like introductory to onboarding. Now, typically your onboarding process has a couple phases. The first is pre-boarding. So this is when you do all of the paperwork, contracts, you sign up for benefits. Some companies, you have to work there for like a full month before you can enroll into their benefits. I think it's like a full month or maybe 14 days, something like that. It's like one payroll cycle, depending on your payroll cycle. Then you're going to have your IT set up. So this did not happen at your retail job because there is no IT involved. But if you work at a company where you sit behind a computer, this is when you're going to get your laptop, you'll get your email. They'll kind of onboard you to the whole process. Then you have a welcome email, and sometimes some of these companies do swag packages. It's kind of cringy, but you see it all the time. People love free shit. Let's be realistic here. People love free shit. So when new people start at companies like Google or some of these like big guys, they give them these like swag packs with like a sweater, a backpack, all kinds of crap in it. Sometimes candy, who knows? And so all of that happens. And then you usually just start to like schedule things out. So you'll schedule your first meeting with your manager. You'll schedule your first day. So all of that happens before day one, usually. Then you start phase 2. Phase 2 is the first 30 days on the job if you're under kind of a more corporate role. And this is where it's really just about orientation and learning. So it's nothing, let's say, super intense always, but it's usually just like you understand the company. They'll give you lessons or like they have training courses, either recorded training courses or sometimes they have live training courses on the company culture, the missions, the value of the business. And that's really important because it kind of starts to teach you how to operate in this job. Then you start to get into role specific training and goals. So this might be like, let's say you're hired fresh out of school to be a social media manager. You might start to learn about the specific social media tools you're using. A lot of the times company has various different technologies that they use for different departments, whether it's HR, whether it's data, IT. Everybody has different softwares and hardwares. And so typically those trainings will start to occur in the first 30 days. You're also going to cover meetings with like key team members. A lot of the times this is just like if you're in a beginning, more junior role, this is going to be your manager. This is going to be the other team members on your team. If you work at a larger company, like some of the big four consulting firms, they have like mentorship programs. And so you might meet with your mentor in these early days if you signed up for some of those programs that they have. And then, of course, HR typically will walk you through like benefits. There will also be compliance training. This is what you did. So all of those videos that they have you watch on like how to not be offensive. Yeah, like how to not be offensive, how to not be a dick, stuff like that. Usually those are all compliance trainings. And that's just stuff that HR are basically required to have people take training. So a lot of that stuff it's a formality. Most of it's common sense, but it's basically a necessity for them to teach employees and prove that employees take the training because let's say later on some bad shit happens. They need to be able to say, like, we gave them all of the protocols. We gave them all of the policies. They knew everything up front. It's one of the many ways companies protect themselves. And then, of course, you might have some early wins and you might have some small projects. It does depend on the type of the role. If it's a very junior role, they're going to start looping you in on tiny projects. But for example, if it's an internship, your orientation is usually like in the first 3 days. You learn a lot of this stuff early on because your internship ends at the end of 3 months or at the end of the summer. So obviously they don't have time to onboard you for 90 days before you can really start working.
Yeah.
Then you go into phase 3. So this is your next 30 days. This is the between 30 to 60 days. A lot of this is really just about like integration and feedback. So taking a much deeper dive into processes, sometimes like procedures that are specific to your jobs. And then, of course, like I mentioned, the tools. Maybe the first month you took certifications, like all of these technologies have basic certifications. And then sometimes you might even need to take even more certifications or at least study for them. So you can see that in the next 30, 60 days. That this is when you also start to have performance check-ins with your manager because like I mentioned, at each 30 days, you do a check-in and you're like, you know, did you accomplish what you were trying to accomplish? Have you moved, you know, towards the goalposts that we're headed towards? And then, of course, you can start contributing to even more projects. So at this point, it's all repetitive and it does depend on what job it is. But in this phase, it's really like you clean up what you didn't finish in the first 30 days, and then you start getting ahead of the next 60 to 90 days. And then the last piece, of course, is phase 4. This is the end of it. This is your last 30 days in the 30, 60, 90. And it's really just about like, at this point, you might be measured for somewhat performance. I know like some large companies, like a Google, like an Amazon, you know, the first month to 2 months, they have like company level trainings that employees participate in where they learn not just about the culture, but let's say you're on a sales team, they teach you about the products, they teach you about how to sell, the sales cycle, how they track, all of those things. And then in those last 30 days, that's when you're expected to start putting some of this knowledge to work. They try to hand over ownership typically. So if you were hired to manage a specific project, during the 60-90 days, that's probably when you're going to get handed off that project. And then at this point, you can really start to begin more cross-team collaboration, potentially start discussing your career development goals. And then a lot of the times, if your company does do great performance reviews, they're going to give you an initial performance review of how you did during onboarding and, you know, what you can expect going forward. So that's the typical process. You look confused.
No, I just I think my main question is, so onboarding and the higher up, not obviously what I do, but so it's kind of not training, but it's more the company just kind of watching you and seeing how you do. So I just it's kind of
well, the company's always watching you.
well, yeah.
I think so. So onboarding is just training for the most part, but it's more like when you move up in roles, it becomes a lot more tactical, right? So if you're the director of a department and you're onboarding, you need to meet all of your employees. You need to learn all of the technology that the company uses, right? Each company has databases that they store, whether it's customer data, whether it's team data, each company has them. And so even if you're HR, there's HR technology that's going to store all of the employee data. Those are the things you learn. So it is training. We'll get into the types of onboarding in a second, and I think that might help you understand it. But it's okay. What you had was one day of a couple training videos that taught you very basic stuff. And then it went straight into here's the different product SKUs, Tara. Here's the different, coupons. Here's how you plug it in, right? So what I'm saying is onboarding is both that part of videos you did at the beginning and the first couple of shifts that you had after those videos where somebody was teaching you on the job, here's how you ring somebody up, here's how you check somebody out. That's also onboarding.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
And when you get into corporate, the big difference is, and this is where I said, in America, the culture isn't to have, a probation period. The corporate is just to be more of let's talk about your first 90 days and let's make sure. Basically, the goal is by the end of 90 days, you can start doing your job more than I need to help you.
Yeah. Okay. I dig. I got it now.
Sweet. Okay. So it's your first introduction to the company. This is also a really critical time because you often will meet other people who are starting out on the job. If you go and work at a big consulting firm, they start all of their new employees at the same time and they have them go through a lot of these things together. So you're in your own cohort. And it's a really good time to start building political allies. It's also an initial time where you might start creating some adversaries and some competition on the early days. But it's really just a time to learn everything about the company and your job. So there's a couple types of onboarding. First, you've got formal versus informal onboarding. So what you had was a mix of formal and informal, right? Because you had structured videos, HR did it, they took care of kind of what you needed to do, and you went through all of these steps. And then there was informal onboarding, where you learned through experiences, through peer interactions, and self-directed kind of exploration and testing without a hardcore predefined structure. Right? There wasn't a list next to you where it said Tara needs to learn how to ring it up. Tara needs to learn how to check it out. Tara needs to learn how to put the products in a bag without them breaking. There wasn't that list next to it. So it was a little bit more informal versus the first part of it when you were watching videos and you were learning basic stuff about the company and about HR policies and things like that. It was very structured. There was documentation, there was a schedule, and there were resources. Then you have tactical versus strategic onboarding. So tactical onboarding, it's focused on just administrative stuff, paperwork, compliance, IT setup, basic job responsibilities, maybe giving you a parking pass, things like that. Then you have strategic onboarding, which goes beyond just logistics and processes and basic stuff. And it really starts to immerse the employees in culture, long-term career development, and relationship building. I can't remember if you said you watched Grey's Anatomy. Did you watch Grey's Anatomy? Or you're a hater? That's what it is. Okay, well,
Yeah, I'm a hater.
there is in the beginning of their intern resident year, when they're all interns or whatever, there's like a mixer that they have where everybody comes together. That's like a new year, and they can meet with some of the senior doctors. They can meet with some of the hospital staff. That is a strategic onboarding session, right? It's a chance for people to socialize. It's a chance for people to start to mingle and get to meet their team. Continuing on, then you have individual versus cohort based onboarding. So a lot of times, if you start in a very specific role, then you're going to have individual onboarding because other people weren't hired for your job. So when I was hired for my last role, like I was onboarded by myself in a bubble. And it's really just like one-to-one sessions that are super specific to the job you were hired for and the needs of that role. Then you have cohort-based onboarding. This is where they start to group new hires and put people into buckets and do them all at the same time. So that was the example I was saying where like if you go to Google and you join sales, they have like sales meetings and there's like a whole cohort of people that recently joined the sales team that starts joining those product trainings and joining those various meetings that get held. Both of them work. It really just depends on your job type. If you're if you're a beginning analyst at an accounting firm, you go through cohort-based onboarding. Because they typically hire a specific number of analysts every year with the objective of growing them to eventually, stay at the company long term. It's really a numbers game when it comes to like hiring junior talent. So continuing on, then you have horizontal versus vertical onboarding. This is the last type. It does sound weird. Horizontal
math.
Oh, okay. Well, it's definitely not math. No need to thumbs down, little T.
All right.
Horizontal onboarding is just like you are exposed to many different teams, departments, company functions. Like there isn't like this very, it is maybe formal in some degrees, but it gives you like a broad exposure of the larger company versus a vertical onboarding is really focused on deep diving into just like a specific role, your specific department, and only things related to your company. So you often hear this term a lot when referred to businesses, but sometimes companies will describe other companies as running in silos. So running in silos basically just means like every team operates on their own and they don't really collaborate with each other a lot. And so in those type of situations, when you're onboarding to a company, you don't talk to this department, you don't talk to that department, you only talk to your department because you operate in a silo.
Yeah.
So those are the types of onboarding. Then you have various forms of onboarding. So part of this might change by your job, right? So best case scenario, you work in person, you have a traditional in-person onboarding session. So this is orientation sessions, instructor-led sessions. Sometimes they have office hours or like team, like that Meredith Grey example with the Grey's Anatomy where they all went to a mixer, right? And then there's like sometimes buddy and mentor programs. I know like of a couple internships where you have a hiring manager and then you also have a mentor from another department. That kind of can help you through your experience. This is good for companies, if you're going to be in person, you want an in-office team, and you definitely, I would say, see this a lot more often when it's hands-on learning. So maybe if you're going to be an Amazon warehouse worker, you're definitely going to see more of an in-person onboarding requirement because you need to know how to use the equipment. You need to know how to use the machinery. Then you have virtual and remote onboarding. This is like boring crap most of the time. But this is like, right, you have like online learning platforms, the virtual meet and greets, pre-recorded videos. I think that's what you watched. You watched a lot of pre-recorded videos.
Lots, yes.
Yeah. And then there's some digital documentation, and self-paced guides. So those all kind of live in the world of virtual. A lot of the times it's like if you're a hybrid team or you have a fully remote company, or let's say you're like customer service for Apple Care. Shout out to all the Apple Care customer service people that I've spent many hours on the phone with. They were probably onboarded virtually. Then there's, of course, blend, which is when there's a little bit of in-person, a little bit of remote. There's also social onboarding. So this is networking events, peer mentorship programs, and ERGs. ERGs are employee resource groups. I don't know how these will change with some of the efforts to DEI changing within companies, but these were like the groups that were like Asians that work here, or like LGBTQIA plus support community. And they create within each of these companies, there's little like subcultures and sub communities that promote their values. They, you know, make sure that the workplace is conducive to them, and all things like that. So it's all tied together. A little bit of social onboarding. And then, of course, there's like technical or even like functional onboarding, which is really specific job trainings, shadowings, you know, receiving your certifications. A lot of the times, if you're like in a software engineer role, your job will require certifications before they can give you access to the technology that you need to build for. The other fun fact is companies are often required to have a certain number of certified members when they're partners with various technologies. And so that's part of how they check those boxes, is they make sure incoming staff is applying and receiving these certs. So bottom line is onboarding is pretty expansive. It can be done in a lot of different ways. It really just depends on your company. Right? And I think, so going into our next favorite section, which is what is the boss's POV? I hated onboarding. Now, I did onboarding uniquely at my company. I know I also said I hated interviewing. I liked onboarding more, but onboarding can be very, I mean, I didn't hate it actually. I shouldn't say that. I enjoyed onboarding new team members. It was just very challenging because trying to teach them so much in such a small amount of time can be really overwhelming.
Yeah.
I remember when I had new team members who would join my team, I would have a 15-minute meeting with them every single day for the first 30 days. And then we had 15-minute meetings, I think, every other day or like twice a week for the 30-60, and then it was like once a week when we got to like, we would just have our regular one-on-ones. But I would have like, for the first initial 30 days, I would always be there every single day because I worked with remote employees, and it's so hard to retain information that you just hear on a, you know, like you're watching a video or you're watching a certification. Like it's very boring. It's easy to fall asleep. I used to encourage my team members to like fold laundry while they watch training videos. Well, it's just, you know, you don't require that much brain thought. You don't have to focus so much on the laundry, and you can at least kind of be a little bit more occupied and stay not falling asleep. So
I would do that. That kept me is they had questions in every video for like every video that was on one page. There's like 50 videos. And you had to answer the questions. If you got them wrong, you had to keep rewatching the videos until you got it right. So I locked in after I figured out the first part. When I first started doing it, it was rough. But they paid me to do it, so I took my time.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's not, I think like it's important to take your time to some degree in terms of, it does depend on the structure. For example, like I was hiring for ad tech. So it was like every person I hired needed to have certifications for the specific technologies that they were going to be supporting or they were going to be working with. And those certifications did not teach you everything you needed to know. I used to explain it as like the certifications kind of teach you what words mean, and it teaches you what you kind of need to understand. And so in addition to those videos, I also would have them watch previously recorded trainings that I had with clients, because I used to run so many trainings with clients. And so I had kind of my version of in-depth explanation of each of these different topics. And so at the end of the day, the way your boss is looking at onboarding is they just want to make sure you're understanding what's happening. I think some bosses, and this is, going to talk about more of it in the red flags area, but if they're rushing you and they're just trying to get you to push and get the work done and all of that stuff, that's a bit of a red flag. Because onboarding for a boss is really just about making sure that they're teeing you up for success so that you can do your job.
So do you guys do like more than one day of onboarding? Like we have the initial onboarding, but like every other month we will have to watch new videos about certain things. I don't know if it's just because we're retail and we need to keep up with the products and like the people, but like.
Yeah, so that's common. So that just depends on industry. If you're in like a large corporate company, there's these meetings called all hands or town hall meetings. And it's when the whole company meets at the same time and they hear from leadership, like what the company's plans are, what direction they're heading in and all of this stuff. That's obviously not onboarding, but it's like the equivalent of what you're talking about, where it's like, oh, here's all the things that are new. Here's all the products we have coming this month. Like, it's a little bit like that. Yours is obviously more on the job specific training, but that's because it's retail.
Yeah.
So, okay, moving into our next section here, going into our mentality check and just, reiterating the way you view something is going to drastically change how you approach it and what the outcomes are. And so for this segment, we're going to focus on shedding light on some of these common. Okay, and now we're going to talk about. No, I hate that. Sorry. And now we can start chatting about our next section, the mentality check, because we know that the way you view something is going to drastically change how you approach it and ultimately the outcomes that come from it. So when it comes to onboarding, let's talk about a few common misconceptions. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that onboarding is just formalities. Why is this wrong? Well, I think this mentality keeps you from making the most of a major networking and ally forming opportunity, especially when it comes to other departments. When you're going through onboarding, a lot of the times, even if you're in an internship or you're at a larger role and you're in somewhat of a silo, there's often going to be meetings where there are other departments involved, even if it's just something small like, I don't know, HR scheduling a handful of people to walk through the benefits packages that your company has. And so when you look at a networking opportunity as just a formality, you don't network and you don't talk to people and you don't meet people. And it's really important in those early days in your career to start forming allies, especially forming allies with other departments. Because let's be realistic, most companies are not fully transparent. They do not share everything that they're doing, right? The executive team doesn't share their calendar invites with interns so that interns know where their leadership is. And they do this, part of it is because there's no need for people to read between the lines and to be nosy. But at the same time, if you don't have allies from other departments, if you don't kind of understand what's going on in other areas of the company, you kind of put yourself in a bad position. So the right mentality is onboarding is your first opportunity to meet people from within and outside your own department, and you can't waste it. So how do you take action? Well, number one, introduce yourself. Don't just walk in and say, oh, my name's Tara Demoto. I'm here to make money. Right? Facts. Take a couple people aside, as factual as it is. Be like, hey, my name's Tara Demoto. I'm here to make money. Want to be friends? Want to grab a coffee? I'd love to hear more about your story, right? Facts. People love, and in corporate culture, it is so common to be like, let's go for coffee. And if they're cool, maybe they'll be like, let's go for a drink. And you'll be like, okay, we should invite the rest of the interns, or we should invite the rest of our cohort. And then you really start to form these close bonds. And those close bonds, not only will they help you in your immediate job, but let's be realistic. People move on, they get other jobs, they go work at other companies. And so making sure you keep connections, right? Like your old manager, in the future, maybe he could be the person who gets you a job at a company you want. You never know where someone's going to end up. So always keep that in mind. Misconception number 2 is that onboarding is just about learning and not necessarily taking action. And I think this is where obviously it depends by specific jobs, but when you think of it as just about a learning experience, it's forgetting about how you're also evaluating the company, right? This isn't just a chance for you to show them that they made the right choice. This is a chance for them to show you that you made the right choice. And this is where you want to, spend the next X years of your life. So the right mentality is that an onboarding period is a trial period for both parties. It's learning for both parties. As much as you're learning about the company, it's also a chance for you to share more about yourself to them and for both parties to assess. This is for a handful of reasons, but it is always easier to walk away in the beginning. And that stands for both parties, right? That's why I was mentioning, in some countries they have probation periods because it's so much easier to step away without getting into the heat of it, whether it's because of legal reasons, whether it's because of, how a company handles firing. Like in certain countries, firing somebody is very difficult. It is very difficult. It requires a lot of paperwork. It requires a lot of notice. In the US, we have at-will employment, which basically means I can fire you at any point in time with no notice, no reason. And you can also quit at any point in time with no notice and no reason. In Poland, for example, if you've worked at a company, I think it's for like a year, you have to give 30-day notice if you're going to quit. And the company, if they're going to fire you, they also have to give you 30-day notice. So there's pros and cons to each of these structures, but in so many ways, this beginning period is a time for you to be closely watching your company, your manager, and getting a sense of what you're walking into for the next 2 to 3 years. So how do we take action? Well, pay attention to the onboarding quality. Don't necessarily make excuses, but pay attention to how it is. Yes, of course, you have startups, and yes, of course, you have environments where there's typically less, structure, less formality, and all of those things. But at the same time, that is a direct notification to yourself of what this company's going to look like for the next 2 years. Because if they don't have certain things put up front for onboarding, it is very unlikely that they're going to have structure for your career development, for how your role grows. And some people thrive in those environments. I surely did, but other people don't. And so it's just a matter of understanding that. And so with that, we can start talking about, as I mentioned, like what do you look for and what are the red flags that you should be paying attention to? The number one red flag, and this is pretty common, right? But it's disorganized or non-existent onboarding. Non-existent onboarding is a pretty big red flag. If there is no structure in how they bring new people onto the company, there's a couple reasons for it. One, it could be that it's like a brand new company with 2 employees, right? That explains to you why it's non-existent. It also gives you a sense of what you're about to walk into because nothing's existent in a company with just 2 employees.
Yeah.
Right? But then it also, in some companies, when they're larger and they have a much bigger structure, if they still don't have any onboarding, it's a little concerning because how? It's incredibly inefficient, right? Yeah. And so this is when you have cases where there's no structured training and sometimes like unclear job expectations. As I mentioned in our previous chat, companies don't always know what they're hiring for. And so that's going to bleed into your onboarding. If there's no agenda, no schedule, or even sometimes there's no materials that they provide and you have to onboard yourself, or even sometimes you're going to see your own manager and HR just scrambling to put it together. Mm-hmm. And so a lack of preparation, it's going to signal poor leadership. It's going to signal a lack of investment in employees. And sometimes it will signal high turnover. Which really, high turnover is just, you're not expected to stay at a company long. They don't invest too long in trying to keep you there. Another red flag is a lack of role clarity. Now, when you first start out in your career, this isn't as much as a problem. Sometimes I will be obvious that, if it's a startup company, there's usually not a lot of role clarity to begin with. But sometimes when you're in an onboarding collaboration with your manager, your job responsibilities are going to seem vastly different than the job description that you applied for. Yeah. It's basically called, there's a specific term for this, and it's called bait and switch hiring, which is just like any other bait and switch, where you have a company's chaotic structure and a manipulative boss that's kind of setting you up for failure, right? Because they told you one thing and then they went and did something completely different. And so this is one big thing. Another thing is they can give like vague or even conflicting direction on what you're supposed to do. And sometimes, the explanations for why they have you working on certain projects, those will just continuously change and not make any sense. Mm-hmm. Now, another red flag that should be obvious, but I think sometimes people underplay how obvious it is an overwhelming or unrealistic workload early on. Or you have the opposite of that, which is absolutely no work at all. I've had this. What internship I had, I was basically begging for work. And it got to a point where I had a conversation with my manager and I flat out said, "You're wasting my time. If you guys don't want to use my talent, I'm going to go work somewhere else and for somebody else, because this is just simply not worth it," right? Yeah. But then you have the other side where when you have an overwhelming amount of onboarding expectations, a lot of the times they call this like, "We want you to hit the ground running." And then they give very little guidance to do this, right? Another thing is when there's no ramp up time. There is always ramp up time for new roles, just because it's a new space, it's a new environment. You need to meet the team, you need to collaborate, you need to, start building trust with various people. And so if you're given no ramp up time and you're a director of a department and they just expect you to come in and start fixing problems, it leads for really, really tense startups in your journey with these companies, and it can be extremely overwhelming, right? And it's a huge problem because it suggests poor management. It also suggests high burnout rates. When I was onboarding people, I was burnt out at one point in time in my career, and I remember onboarding felt like the most exhausting thing in the world because I had to wait multiple weeks before somebody could start doing work. And it would drive me nuts, right? But I would give them the time. But at the same end of it, I was desperate for them to start taking tasks over and to start doing things. And I was high burnout. A lot of people at my old company were high burnout. And sometimes companies have a sink or swim culture where it's like, if you can't make it through this pressure test of hell, then bye-bye. Right? And that's what you're going to see with these overwhelming workloads. And a lot of times it can prove that you can't cut it at a company, but it's like, do you want to cut it at a crazy company that overworks you from the literal first day you start? Yeah. Probably not. All right. Another red flag is struggling, I should say, to access the right people and resources that you need. So sometimes if you see a situation where, I don't know, you need to go find a manual and they tell you to go talk to person A, and person A doesn't have the manual. They send you to person B. Person B doesn't have the manual. They send you to person C. Nobody knows who is responsible for what at that company. Nobody is taking accountability for their work. And it just shows you how baseline dysfunctional a business is. If key stakeholders for your job are unavailable, then that's going to put you in a really isolated position where you can't do your function and you can't succeed. Mm-hmm. And so even sometimes, you might request tools, you might request logins, you might request all of these things because you need it, but it's ignored, it's delayed, it's all of these things. It just shows you've got a dysfunctional company. There's a passive-aggressive culture where new hires are getting left to struggle alone. And at the end of the day, how you act in the first 90 days as not only an individual but as a company is going to be really telling of how the rest of the experience will be. And that is surely not a good experience. Now, a couple more is big red flag is you have high turnover and you have employees who seem checked out. So I see this now with some of my clients where, you know, their C team is completely checked out. And I'm trying to get people excited. I'm trying to talk about new initiatives, but there's such a, they're also burned out, right? There's probably been turnover on other teams. And I don't know, maybe they mentioned a couple people have left. You start to see this, you know, us versus them attitude towards leadership. Me, I'm working with the leaders. So there is always an us versus them mentality when you work with leaders. And although that's not necessarily a good thing, it's pretty common. And I think that when you see your leaders checked out, just like I said in the last pod, right? The fish rots at the head. And so if the people up top are checked out and burnt out, it's going to trickle down to every single person in that business. And so this is a problem just because, you know, it usually means you have pretty toxic leadership when you have people who are highly burnt out. A lot of the times there's also just a lot of unfulfilled promises. I remember one of the companies I worked for promised to pay bonuses and it took them a year to pay the bonuses, which is crazy.
That is crazy, yeah.
So it's just, you know, the early days of onboarding can be very telling. Now, there's also the chance where they have perfect onboarding and they're still a super crazy company. We'll get into that later. There's more signs you have down the line, right? Eventually, everything comes exposed. Okay, so now another red flag, no work-life balance or boundaries. I used to have a manager. So on Slack, I don't know if have you used Slack, Little T?
Slack? No.
It's like a messaging system. Okay, so Slack is like a messaging system. You can create group chats. You could create all these things. I remember I had a manager once who would smile and told me that one of their favorite features in Slack was this one button that was notify anyway. And basically, in Slack, you can set working hours of when you can receive notifications and when you can receive messages. When you have somebody's notifications, like if you want to send them a message past the hours that they set, there is literally a button in Slack that says notify anyways. So basically, ignore their boundary, push this message at 10 p.m., 9 p.m., or whatever it is. And yeah, I had a manager who that was their favorite feature. So a lot of telltale signs as to like.
That's my favorite feature when you have your phone on Do Not Disturb. Send quietly.
Wow. Little T just trying. I honestly, I don't even notice when I turn my phone on Do Not Disturb. But before I get
it's
too
always
distracted. On. Okay, awkward. Okay, putting me on blast. Well,
sorry.
Anyways, why is this so problematic? It's so problematic because you're basically entering into like a grind culture where they really focus on just getting work done. It glorifies burnout. Like I remember when I was starting in my career, I was like, man, I wish I had more meetings. Like everybody has so many meetings and like they all seem so important. And then I got to the other side of it where I had nothing but meetings and I was important. And I was like, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. Being in meetings for 7 hours straight, shoot me, please. So all of that's, you know, big red flag. Another one that seems pretty obvious, but sometimes can be hard to realize in the moment is a negative or manipulative leadership. So sometimes your boss will talk negatively about former employees or competitors or other people in the industry. They're going to make maybe passive aggressive comments. They might have microaggressions. Oftentimes they'll always dodge accountability and shift blame to others. So what does this look like on the job? Oh, well, why isn't this project started? Or why is this project taken 3 much longer than it was supposed to? And, you know, I'm taking over the project now, so I'm trying to understand context. And your boss might answer you and said, oh, well, the director of this department was running it, and so it failed because they didn't know what they were doing, and their team, they don't know what they're doing either because they're a bad leader. And you start to see like it's giving toxic. They're blaming everyone but themselves. They're not taking any accountability for it. And it's just like those are some really, really easy warning signs of like why things don't go. Or even sometimes if you talk poorly about the whole company. Like I used to do this, and for me, I thought I was just like being honest, because people would ask like, why don't things get done? And I would be like, honestly, I don't know, but nothing gets done here. Things just don't make sense.
Yeah.
And although it wasn't super like negative and I wasn't being mean about it, like for me, I was just being honest. But at the end of the day, that's not necessarily something that you want to see at like the beginning of your job. And it can make you feel a sense of camaraderie with your boss. Like, oh, they're letting me in. They're telling me, what they don't tell other employees. But at the end of the day, if somebody's willing to talk badly about somebody else in a professional setting, they are willing to talk badly about you. And that's something to keep in mind. So trust your gut. Use the early warning signs, right? If you see manipulation, if you see control, if you're getting gaslit day 0, don't ignore the red flags. And I think the last one, run. The last red flag, and this kind of ties into some of the other stuff, but it's a resistance to feedback or questions. So sometimes it's like the ring around the rosy. If you ask a shitty boss for a process that doesn't exist, they're going to be like, oh, we wrote something 5 years ago. Let me find it. And then it'll be 2 months. And of course, they never even went to look for it. Okay.
Oh, just like the guy who's supposed to do my tire never went to go actually look for the tire.
Absolutely. I mean, a little different. He wasn't your boss, but like, yes, he was supposed to change your tire. He told you he was going to go look at other places for it. And he ended up not even asking and straight up lied, right?
Yes.
So dodging questions about processes or role expectations, especially role expectations. Like if you are asking your boss, what means success in 6 months or in 3 months? Like at the end of my onboarding, what equals success for you? And they can't give you an answer, or they're dismissing it, or they're like, oh, well, if you get enough of your work done. Oh, well, if you get enough of these things done. They have zero interest in helping you succeed. And sometimes they might even be just like they don't care that you're there. And so if they don't care now, they are surely not going to care later. Then you have sometimes like constructive feedback will be ignored and they'll start taking it personally. I've seen this happen before where let's say somebody comes in and they say, oh, well, the company I used to work for used to handle this in this way. Sometimes they'll take it personally and be like, well, we do it this way is better. And it's definitely not. It is definitely worse. But they're convinced. They're like, don't, come at my own ideas.
Yeah.
So a lot of red flags to look for. I definitely wish I knew these at the beginning of my career because I am pretty sure I have experienced quite literally all of them. Part of that's probably also because I worked at startups, and startups are just notoriously bad at structure because they just haven't built it yet. They haven't made it to that point. But I guess to wrap up this show and conclude our chat on onboarding. Onboarding is a trial period for both parties. It is a chance to get to know both parties better and see if the relationship's going to work out long term. A company's onboarding is a good tell of the overall employee development practices. If they can't develop you in the beginning, they surely do not have measures later down the line to facilitate your career growth. And it's going to give you a good sense of what you can expect in the coming years. Another big thing is onboarding is a huge chance to network. Making connections and forming small bonds with people is exactly how you might change your career down the line. You never know where people will end up. You never know who can help you down the line. So ask people for coffee. Try to have water cooler talk if you're in person. It's really the only time at this business where you're going to be clear-minded. You're not going to have a crazy workload. Everything else is pretty non-existent, and you're exclusively focused on learning about the business and meeting more people. So you are quite literally having dedicated paid time to meet people and grow and understand who you're going to collaborate for the years to come. And so the last piece here is don't get too caught up in the excitement. Onboarding can also be like a honeymoon phase in a relationship. It's beginning, you're so excited, you got a job. You might even ignore some of these massive, massive red flags. And you're just so excited and focused on showing the company you made the right choice that you don't pay attention to the wrong choices you could have made. Always stay skeptical and always continue to assess your career choices. And that's it for our episode today on onboarding, Lil T. We did it. That's a wrap. Peace and love, everyone.
Peace and love.